Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to our Centenary Festival of Holism and Evolution. My name is Michael Stock, and Claudius asked me to say a few words at the beginning and at the end of each day. But let me start with three invitations, which I think you will have heard many times before. Please, if you would like,
If you would
write,
like.
if you would like to write your name and where you are from. Feel free to leave your cameras on and please post questions in the chat. So, in the last few years, I've joined many of the Holos online talks and read Jan Smuts' book, Holism and Evolution. I also had the opportunity to visit Claudius and Michel on the mountain and seen their views on a clear day all the way south to Africa. 12 years ago, in 2014, I had joined a week of holism and leadership, which Claudius created at Schumacher College down in Devon in the west of England. And that group continued to meet up for some time. I remember we were an enthusiastic, lively mix of explorers and pioneers from many countries with wonderful speakers invited from around the world, online and in person, including two special people I'd like to take a moment to mention. Professor Eve Middleton Kelly, who founded the Complexity Research Group at LSE, joined us and introduced the hopeful principle of expanding the space of possibilities when thinking about the complex challenges we all face together. Expanding the space of possibilities still resonates with me. The other person I would like to mention is the late Stefan Harding, who you may know from his book, Animate Earth. Stefan led us on one of his deep time walks along the Devon coast to Dartmouth, which certainly helped me grasp something of our extraordinary long journeys living on Earth, evolving so far. But after Stefan's 3 hour walk from the past, deep in conversations, I had two questions. What now for our futures? And was there an upward path? Well, with those rich memories of people and places, a very warm welcome to this centenary festival of holism and evolution. And so now to Claudius and his introduction to our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is I think it's a historic moment, a century of the writing of the book Holism and Evolution. I think that's a historic moment. And what we have found, and Professor Du Pisani, who I introduce in a minute, will indicate that, is that the general understanding of holism and evolution has not hardly gone to the depth of what actually was intended, what is there. Hasn't gone there. And so this opportunity after 100 years is to re-explore that even more deeply. What is deeply satisfying is that more and more people are engaging with holism. More and more people, scientists, philosophers, are engaging with it and also taking a look at the author, Jan Smuts. And so it is a great pleasure that Professor Du Pisani, who's an authority on Jan Smuts, will be taking us on Smuts's own journey through the development of his insights to the publishing of this book and to the deeper meaning of the core element, and that is who we are as a human species becoming with this concept of personality. So Professor Du Pisani is one of the most foremost scholars And he'll be opening the program by setting Smuts's life and work in both a historical and a philosophical context. And Professor Du Pisani is the author of this amazing book, which I'm showing you here. It's a thick book called Jan Smuts, Son of the Veld, Pilgrim of the World. He's the editor-in-chief. There's some wonderful writers there. And he's a specialist at the Northwest University in South Africa in the history of soil degradation in South Africa, the environmental history, and then also the political history of South Africa. So his understanding of Smuts is not only from a historical perspective, but from an ecological perspective. And so with those words, I hand over to Professor Du Pisani. And remember, as Professor Du Pisani does his presentation, if questions are coming up in your mind, do commit them to the chat box. And we're going to be relaxed about this. So we're going to help Professor Du Pisani get his PowerPoint up. So share screen.
Rudis, can you hear me?
There you go. Perfect. Guide him.
And then the full screen, the same box.
Where must I go now?
The same box is up on your left-hand corner. Up on your left hand, that one. Yep.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Michael and Claudius, for your introduction. Thanks, Claudius, for organizing this online event. And thank you for the privilege that you give me the opportunity to do my presentation. And right at the start, I want to wish you well with the rest of the program, phase 2, and after that. Okay, so I'm ready to go. Good evening, everyone. My presentation deals with Jan Smuts as a prophet of hope in an age of anxiety and how he formulated his message of hope in the last 3 chapters of Holism and Evolution. Now, Smuts experienced many ups and downs in his career, and it's amazing that in the darkest hours of the 3 wars in which he participated, every time he emerged as a messenger of hope after witnessing terrible death and destruction. He just never seemed to lose hope, had an indomitable belief in the upward trajectory of the world. In widely publicized utterances, he became a visionary of hope for his own people in South Africa, but also for the people of Europe. So my presentation focuses particularly on how Smuts applied the concept of holism as an instrument of hope. And I argue that holism, his brainchild, which found its highest expression in Holism and Evolution, the book of which we now celebrate the centenary, served as the foundation of Smuts's optimism. So I'll start by looking at the roots of Smuts's optimism, and then I'll sketch the historical context, both in Europe and in South Africa, in 1926, when Smuts sat down and wrote Holism and Evolution. Then I'll analyze the last 3 chapters, chapters 10, 11, and 12 of the book. Chapter 10 that deals with personality, the highest form of holism in Smuts's view. Chapter 11 that deals with the prospect of human perfection. And chapter 12 that deals with what he calls the friendly holistic universe. And then I'll conclude my presentation by outlining the different ways in which holism and evolution served as a message of hope. So, starting with the roots, many influences directed Smuts's mind towards an optimistic, holistic outlook, including his religious beliefs, his internalization of the ideas of leading thinkers, the remarkable advancement of science at that point in history, and also the example that he took from great personalities. Now, starting with religion, Smuts's Christian upbringing in a devoutly Christian family had a lifelong impact on his worldview. He was not a conventional Christian Afrikaner who attended church every Sunday, but during his life of 80 years, he never renounced his faith. In the religious Smuts, Piet Beekes, who, as an employee in the Prime Minister's department, had had a very close personal acquaintance with Smuts, reached the conclusion that he was a deeply religious man, a devoted Christian, and an admirer and follower of Jesus. In the Sunday school, the confirmation class, prayer meetings, church services, and by reading his Bible and other religious material, the young Smuts became acquainted with the Christian articles of faith and worldview, and also the church doctrine. Augustine's City of God, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the works of Christian eschatology portrayed the advancement of humankind and the end times in terms of successive emergent stages and excuse me, contributed to Christian theology and philosophy the linear conception of time as a directed succession of events eventually culminating in a perfect new heaven and new earth. The eschatological promise in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, of the triumph of good over evil and eternal bliss for the faithful in the new heaven and new earth, sustained Christian believers through times of hardship. By the time that Smuts was a student in Cambridge in the 1890s, the idea of progress had been secularized, shifting away from the notion of advancement in a divinely ordained, desirable direction to a promised land somewhere beyond the grave, to one of a better life here on earth, warranted by scientific and technological development. Prominent Western thinkers like Nietzsche and Freud renounced the Christian faith and the existence of God. Through his extensive study of the development of Western thinking, Smuts was well aware of the challenge that secularization was posing to the Christian religion. His exposure to the views of thinkers such as Bacon and Hegel, Kant, Whitman, led him to a reassessment of his own religious beliefs and worldview. He said that his study of the American poet Walt Whitman had given him a new perspective on religion by freeing him from his conventional and puritanical preconceptions due to his pious upbringing. But he never relinquished his religion, and he, throughout his life, continued, excuse me, to emphasize the importance of the idea of God and the kingdom of God for the individual soul. However, he left his childhood adherence to the church and its doctrine behind. In the Whitman essay, he wrote that religion does not depend on the church and that the soul can really confront religion when it extricates itself from the churches. Smuts found himself very much in tune with the way in which the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, practiced the Christian religion. His close friendship from 1906 with the Clark and the Gillett families in England brought him in touch with the Quakers' absence of formal religious ritual, their emphasis on silence and understanding of the living Christ presence within. For Smuts, the Quaker belief that inner light, that's what the Quakers call it, inner light, God's presence in each person, should be the primary focus of an individual's faith over creed or doctrine, was an ideal worth following. This view corresponds to, for example, Kierkegaard's idea that God can only be known through a leap of faith, as he called it, by the individual believer. Although Smuts had outgrown the fundamentalist Christian outlook of his childhood, he remained a Christian believer who kept his eyes on the promise of the eventual triumph of good over evil. The hopeful Christian vision of linear upward advancement fundamentally influenced his worldview and remained an inspiration behind his lifelong optimistic outlook. When Smuts studied in Cambridge in the 1890s, his exposure to many new scientific and philosophical influences broadened his worldview. He engaged in voracious reading, and his mind sucked up the ideas in the works of the influential thinkers of the time, people like Immanuel Kant, Charles Darwin, Baruch Spinoza, and others. He synthesized the ideas of the various thinkers into his own intellectual and philosophical framework. Smuts was especially drawn to the philosophical views of Immanuel Kant in his critique of pure reason and other works. He regarded Kant as the profoundest thinker and derived many of his ideas from Kant's argumentation. Kant had also a very strong impact on Smuts's religious views and his holistic thinking. He, Smuts, agreed with Kant that God's existence cannot be proved by reason or by science. He realized that religion and science are different modes of the quest for ultimate truth, and that belief in God is a matter of faith, not knowledge. However, Kant's view that belief in a divine designer is justifiable and that science does not rule out the validity of the belief in the truth of religion was a comfort to Smuts. He was in full agreement with Karl Barth's contention that mortals cannot reason out God. He believed, like the Christian revivalists, that the Bible could be interpreted in such a way that it did not contradict science, evolution, and common sense. Teleology, the goal-directed belief that natural objects and processes are designed for specific purposes and should be explained by their intended purpose, was a very important element of Smuts's holistic thinking. When he developed his holistic thinking, biologists were rejecting Aristotle's teleological approach and the view that nature was the product of rational planning. For Smuts, however, teleology suggested a designed, a purposeful universe, and therefore it played a significant role in his development of the concept of holism. He argued in Holism and Evolution that the understanding of living organisms requires a teleological interpretation that recognizes the organism's inherent purposeful drive towards creating a whole. During Smuts's time in Cambridge, idealism, a metaphysical approach to knowledge strongly influenced by Kant and Hegel, was the leading academic paradigm in British philosophical thinking. Smuts studied Hegelian philosophy and the idealist thinking by persons like Green, Bosanquet, Collingwood, Oakeshott, and several others. Although he departed from Hegelian and absolute idealism, he continued to draw on idealist principles and concepts. Sweet calls him a personal idealist. Smuts uh, received his education at a time when the great idea of progress, as it was called, was a dominant paradigm in Western thinking. The idea that mankind, with the new science and improved technology, had entered on a road of necessary and unlimited progress was first articulated a long time before by Fontenelle in 1683. Between 1750 and 1900, the idea of progress reached its zenith in the Western civilization. As a result of the work of Turgot, Condorcet, Saint-Simon, Comte, Hegel, Marx, Spencer, many others, it became the dominant idea of that period. The link between progress and modern empirical and exact science was consolidated, and the conviction that science was the golden avenue to the future grew stronger and stronger. The idea of a law of progress and its potential benefits took shape in the 19th century in Auguste Comte's writings on positive philosophy. Comte, and also Hegel, Marx, Spencer, and others, described the inexorable, irreversible, stage by stage, and unstoppable advance of humankind through successive stages towards a golden age on Earth. There was optimism that scientific and technological progress could lead not only to material prosperity, but also to the moral perfection of humankind. And Smuts bought into this idea, the great idea of progress. It further boosted his expectations of a better world. Smuts grew up in a period of significant advancement of scientific knowledge, which influenced the intellectual atmosphere. He was eager to learn and kept himself updated with the latest advances, excuse me, in the fields of biology, physics, and psychology. Smuts was deeply influenced by Darwin's theories of evolution, which were gaining wider acceptance when he was a student. He described Darwin as a thinker that made a greater difference for human thought than any other. And Smuts used Darwin's theories to support his idea that there is no absolute division between physical nature on the one side and spiritual mental life on the other side. And it was also the foundational scientific basis for his conceptualization of holism, hence the title of the book, Holism and Evolution. He argued that holism is the underlying link, making life and mind the natural outcome of the evolutionary process. He deviated from classical Darwinism and shifted the focus from accidental individual adaptations to a creative, directed process of whole making. He was particularly impressed by Henri Bergson's interpretation in his book Creative Evolution, that evolution is driven not by chance or mechanism, but by a vital impetus, a creative inward impulse that drives life to create new forms and complex organisms, propelling life forward in what he called a creative surge. What Bergson termed a vital impetus, Smuts called holism. In Holism and Evolution, Smuts redefined evolution as the progressive creation of higher, more complex wholes. Smuts regarded Darwin's approach as too focused on the rudimentary ends of the evolutionary chain, failing to explain the higher achievements of creative imagination and human personality. Smuts praised Einstein for the new perspective which his theory of relativity opened up, superseding the former coherent Newtonian conception of the world. However, the relativism introduced by the new physics was at variance with Smuts's metaphysical and teleological arguing around the concept of holism. He nevertheless stuck to his guns and did not allow contrary ideas to let him deviate from his holistic theory as a coherent explanation of the universe. He saw his task as helping to what he called build a stable world of ideas. I come to the context in which the book was written. In a time of rapid change, the zeitgeist in Europe switched between the opposing moods of optimism and pessimism. In a period early in the 20th century when pessimism threatened to overshadow optimism, Smuts's aim was to counter anxiety and pessimism by putting forward the concept of whole making as the successor to the then fading great idea of progress. The 19th century was for the Western world a time of advancement of science, of technology, and material prosperity. Economies were growing, education, healthcare, and living standards were improving. It was a period of ordered stability in which Europe's world domination and grandeur reached its zenith. A generally optimistic worldview and an overwhelming belief in progress prevailed during that period called the La Belle Époque. Scientific, technological, and material advancement strengthened the belief in humankind's linear historical progress toward ultimate fulfillment, and that there was development towards a bright future characterized by scientific knowledge, technological sophistication, prosperity, happiness, freedom. Spencer stated that progress was inevitable, that immorality must disappear, and that, what he said, man must become perfect. The pervasive optimism was ended by the Great War, a war of carnage and decimation, causing staggering human and material losses. It caused the demise of empires, the redrawing of European borders, and the end of Europe's global primacy. In its wake followed the rise of totalitarianism and dictatorships. The war completely changed the zeitgeist of the Western world. The pre-war optimism made way for cynicism. Nikolai Berdyaev stated the following. He said, man's historical experience has been one of steady failure, and there are no grounds for supposing it will be ever anything else. So the belief in progress and reason was fading. Oswald Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes gave expression to the pessimism and relativism of the post-war period. He described World War I as the inevitable outward manifestation of the historical crisis of the Western civilization, which was in a terminal, irreversible decline. Spenglerism fundamentally altered Western thinking by shattering the belief in linear progress, introducing a fatalistic, cyclical view of history, and promoting a relativist perspective. It resonated with post-World War I disillusioned thinkers and stimulated intellectual pessimism. The period between the two world wars is often called the age of anxiety. The psychological effects of the Great War lingered. Excuse me. A war-induced neurotic syndrome caused pessimists to regard human nature as incorrigible. Sigmund Freud's contention that human behavior is essentially irrational undermined the optimism about the rational and progressive nature of the human mind. In his essay, The Crisis of the Mind, Paul Valéry wrote that, and I quote, the illusion of a European culture has been lost. Knowledge has been proved impotent to save anything whatever. Science is mortally wounded and put to shame by the cruelty of its applications. Idealism is barely surviving. Realism is hopeless, beaten. Faith are confused. End of quote. Despite these pessimistic tendencies, the 1920s was a period of rebuilding after the Great War. A short economic boom followed the end of World War I, and in the Western world, especially in the USA, the era saw unprecedented industrial growth, accelerated consumer demand, and significant changes in lifestyle and culture. There was remarkable advancement in science and technology, and the large-scale adoption of automobiles, telephones, motion pictures, radio, household electricity. In the midst of the encouraging signs, some Western intellectuals, such as H.G. Wells in his Outline of History, clung to the hope that better times were in store for the world. However, a dark cloud of tension remained as the fear that conflict could lead to another devastating war did not disappear. So, what I'm saying is that the first motivation for Smuts to write Holism and Evolution was to bring a message of hope to the world in what he correctly perceived as dangerous times. For Jan Smuts, the 1920s was not a particularly successful period. In the preceding years, 1917 to 1919, during his stay in London, he was treated by the British as a hero. He emerged as a prominent statesman who applied his holistic thinking to take a leading role in the design of new governance structures for the proposed Commonwealth nations and the League of Nations. Smuts then he returned to succeed Louis Botha as Prime Minister. So his first term as Prime Minister between 1919 and 1924 was definitely not easy. Although he had reached the apex of his political career by holding the highest office in the government, the routine work of leading the South African government was not nearly as glamorous as the hero worship he had experienced in London. Back home, he faced strong opposition, mainly from nationalistically minded Afrikaners supporting Hertzog's National Party. The National Party propagandists portrayed Smuts as an enemy who, through his collaboration with the leaders of the British Empire and English-speaking South Africans, had turned his back on Afrikaners and their aspirations. Smuts, in that time, had to face one political setback after the other. As leader of the governing South African Party, he was forced to collaborate and fuse with the pro-British Unionist Party to stay in power in the 1920 and 1921 elections. He stern measures to quell the Bulhoek uprising in 1921 and the Rand mine worker revolt and the Bondelswarts Rebellion in 1922 made him extremely unpopular. The Labour Party and the National Party formed a coalition called the Pact, which unseated the Smuts government in the 1924 election. Smuts was stunned by the extent of his rejection. He achieved so much success and received so many accolades in the first 50 years of his life that he never before had experienced a lack of confidence. The praise that was bestowed on him for his achievements boosted his self-esteem. But now, with his ousting from power in 1924, his general optimistic outlook was dented. The prospects for him to return to power soon did not seem very promising. His failure as a South African politician after his successes as an imperial statesman made it necessary for Smuts to boost himself and restore his confidence. So, the second motivation for him to write Holism and Evolution was therefore to boost his confidence in himself after a period of trials and tribulations in his political career. Relieved of his governmental duties in 1924, Smuts had time to return to the more comprehensive formulation of his holistic outlook, building on the earlier texts about this topic that he had written. With his knowledge about the new advances in the biological and physical sciences, Smuts sat down in his study, reworked and expanded the ideas in his earlier manuscripts, and wrote Holism and Evolution. When it was published, the 56-year-old Jan Smuts had 70% of his life and a world of experience behind him. Smuts's intention that holism and evolution should serve as a message of hope is particularly evident in the last three chapters of Holism and Evolution. In chapter 10, with the title Personality as a Whole, Smuts returns to the topic of Walt Whitman, A Study in the Evolution of Personality, the 200-page essay that he had written in 1895, his last year at Cambridge. In the essay, Smuts had investigated the development of the personality of the American poet through successive cycles of growth. The Whitman study made Smuts aware of the creative power of those eminent individuals who are able to rise above the limitations of external conditions towards self-realization and freedom and enter the field of higher spiritual values and creativeness. He believed that the study of great individuals such as Goethe and Whitman would reveal insights into the nature of the evolutionary process of the universe. He believed that holism was the driving force behind the development of personality. Smuts further developed the theme of personality in an inquiry into the whole, the manuscript of 13 chapters and 300 typed pages, which he wrote in the years 1911 and 1912. In that text, he argues that the human personality is the most highly developed form resulting from the whole making process. Back to chapter 10 of Holism and Evolution, where Smuts defines personality as follows, I quote, "It is the conscious individuality in each of us which arises from the synthesis of our psychophysical elements uniquely blended in each case." End of quote. For Smuts, this synthesis of uniquely blended elements in the human personality is achieved through the process of holism. In his view, the theories by Gülings, Leibniz, Spinoza, for example, about the relationship between body and mind contain elements of truth, but the real explanation is that holism is the creative agent behind all that happens between the component elements of personality. Uh, he reiterates his belief that personality is the highest stage yet attained in the evolutionary process, beginning with matter, organisms, and mind. He calls personality the culminating phase of the great holistic movement and the supreme embodiment of holism. He states, all experience, all intuitions, judgments, actions, beliefs, and other mental acts are holistic products of personality. In the early 20th century, urbanization had created an impersonal environment in the European cities where people experience feelings of alienation. Human individuality seemed tenuous. Smuts responded to this by emphasizing in chapter 10 the unique individuality of each person, stating that personality is a unique creative novelty in every human being. What's important for my view of Smuts as a prophet of hope is that he linked the holistic development of personality to human progress in the world in general. In his Whitman essay, for example, Smuts had stated that no other poet has sung with equal passion the great cause of progress, and that Whitman was inspired with hope and trust in the future of humanity. In Whitman's poetry, Smuts had seen references to what he called the ultimate unity and harmony of all things, the immanent seed of perfection and eternally progressive continuity. Now, 30 years later, in chapter 10 of Holism and Evolution, Smuts reiterates his belief in reason and the great idea of progress. He sets himself against the pessimistic intellectuals of the 1920s by boldly asserting that humankind has the potential to acquire moral perfection. He argues that the human personality is a relative newcomer in the evolutionary process of holism, that it is still immature and a whole in the making. He states that personality is, I quote, destined to complete mastery over the old regular routine and to achieve freedom, creativeness, and value on a scale undreamt of by us today. End of that quote. He agrees with the belief by Leibniz and other philosophers in the perfectibility of human nature. Thus, Smuts still has a hopeful vision of the future prospects of humankind despite the atmosphere of uncertainty in the aftermath of the Great War. His view is that no field of study, including psychology, has studied personality in its entirety. Therefore, a science of personality, which he in this chapter calls personology, needs to be established as a distinct discipline. Personology must study personality synthetically as living unities and wholes through a series of biographies of prominent poets, artists, writers, thinkers, religious and social innovators. In line with Darwin's belief that everything is subject to universal laws that can be uncovered, Smuts predicts that personology will result in the establishment of a law of personality. In his view, personology has the potential to develop into the crown of all sciences. Then we go to chapter 11, which is titled Some Functions and Ideals of Personality. In this chapter, Smuts explains what he regards as the ideal personality, and he discusses the elements that are, in his view, necessary to achieve the perfection of personality. Smuts states that personality is, I quote, a more or less balanced whole or structure of various tendencies and activities maintained in progressive harmony by the holistic unity of the personality itself. End of the quote. Because of the, according to Smuts, extreme youth of personality in the history of evolution, control over the development of personality is still imperfect. Even in the highest individuals, Smuts says, personality is not yet fully developed. According to him, more holistic control can be achieved through willpower and moral discipline, which will result in greater strength of mind and character, better coordination of all impulses and tendencies, less internal friction, more peace of mind, and finally, that spiritual purity, integrity, and wholeness, which is the ideal of personality. Creativeness, freedom, and purity for Smuts are the main characteristics of the ideal personality. It is, in his view, possible to achieve the ideal by the sublimation of the lower elements in human nature into the higher ones to achieve harmonious coordination of the higher and the lower in the holistic personality. In Holism and Evolution, Smuts emphasizes the importance of freedom as one of the highest values of the spirit. Holism for Smuts entails the ever-widening reign of freedom. He argues that as ever higher forms come into being, there is an increase in freedom when humans succeed in becoming masters of their own destinies. Freedom, writes Smuts, is the full measure of self-realization to which each individual aspires. A decline in freedom leads to a climate of intolerance and opens the way for people to accept new tyrannies. Peace, contentment, and happiness are not possible without freedom. Without external freedom and internal harmony, the individual personality cannot find dignity and wholeness. So, excuse me. Perfection is, in Smuts's view, achievable. He writes, I quote, "The ideal person is he in whom this inner control is sufficiently powerful to harmonize all the discordant elements and tendencies of the personal character into one harmonious whole, and to restrain all wayward, random activities which are in conflict with that harmony." Uh, that's the end of the quote. The future evolution of personality is, according to Smuts, the largest ray of hope in human destiny. He writes that even in discouraging circumstances, humans are able to win moral victories which form the great landmarks of personal and human progress. Now, all of this sounds very idealistic. The crux of the matter is that Smuts believes there is room for improvement of the human personality, and through the unstoppable working of the process of holism, the human race will progress towards moral perfection. He concludes the chapter by stating that the inner call of holism is to the wholeness and perfection of the personality. In his view, the warfare in the soul issues either in the attainment of wholeness and freedom and membership in the immortal order of the whole, or otherwise in defeat, enslavement, and death. That brings us to the last chapter, chapter 12, with the title The Holistic Universe. In this chapter, Smuts ponders the state of the world at the time when he is writing the text. He comes to the optimistic conclusion that the universe is moving in the direction of wholeness and victory over evil. This is a world of whole making, he writes. There is, according to him, a universal ground plan of which holism is the core. In his view, the fundamental character of the universe is to be composed of ever more complex and advanced wholes. Holism, he argues, is a more accurate description of reality than partial and one-sided worldviews such as naturalism, idealism, and monadism. Smuts knew that in the age of scientific advance, metaphysics was losing ground because it was not empirically testable. Wittgenstein, for example, wrote in his essay on logical philosophy that the great philosophical issues about God, freedom, and morality were senseless because they could not be tested by scientific experiments. Therefore, Smuts particularly makes a point of stating that although holism cannot be proved by experimental verification, he regards it as a proper scientific concept, which is necessary to account for the facts and phenomena of evolution. It is, in his opinion, the basis of a new Weltanschauung within the framework of science. For him, holism is the key to the interpretation of the universe. He concedes that the universe contains unreason, contradiction, error, evil, sin, and suffering, but he believes that the holistic process does not lead to chaos and hopeless, irreconcilable conflict. The steadily rising series of wholes will result in the freedom and harmony of a more profoundly cooperative universe. In his Whitman essay, Smuts had already stated that the universe is at bottom sound and good, and that there is a tendency towards a greater ideal cosmos. In Holism and Evolution, chapter 12, he regards holism as the inner guarantee of eventual victory for the striving towards human betterment. I quote, he says, it's in spite of all setbacks and defeats. And his conclusion is that in spite of all antagonisms and troubles, we come in the end to feel that this is a friendly universe. This is reminiscent of Leibniz's optimistic view that our world is the best possible world that God could have created. In a rather unique way, going against all the pessimistic tendencies in the time of anxiety, in the interwar years, Smuts interprets the Great War, despite all its death and destruction, as part of the human struggle for good and a step towards human betterment. He writes that holism is at work even in the conflicts and confusions of men, and that the immeasurable sacrifices during the war have not been in vain. Smuts and the other founders of the League of Nations in 1919 had high hopes that it could somehow guarantee collective security and prevent a situation like the one that had caused the First World War. Crick, one of the authors that wrote in my book, argues that with his text, The League of Nations, a Practical Suggestion, Smuts succeeded in changing the post-war world and giving it hope for a better future. The League seemed to point to a better world order. President Woodrow Wilson said that the League was he called it a definitive guarantee of peace and also our covenant of friendship. Now in 1926, Smuts, sharing Kant's optimism that perpetual peace can be secured through international cooperation, absolutely pins his hope on the League of Nations to guide the world to international cooperation. He regards the League as what he calls the chief constructive outcome of the war and also the expression of the deeply felt aspiration towards a more stable, holistic human society. Smuts calls upon his fellow human beings to continue striving for what is good. He is sure that in what he calls the rugged upward path of the universe, the ideals of well-being, truth, beauty, and goodness will not be endangered or lost. It is, he states, in the nature of the universe to strive for and slowly, but in ever increasing measure, to attain wholeness, fullness, blessedness. He concludes the chapter by stating the rise and self-perfection of wholes in the whole. Uh, he says it is the slow but unerring process and goal of the holistic universe. Let me just hear, how am I for time? Do I still have
Go
a few
for,
minutes?
you can go. You can go.
Okay. Now, um, I'm going to cut out a few paragraphs that I wrote about the how Smuts uh, plan to write a follow-up in which the divine would be brought in and would feature as in his scheme of holism, but that's not really um, pertinent to my argument. So I'm going to skip to the next slide. Those who study Smuts's career know that advocates for racial and gender equality criticize him for being a racist and a white male chauvinist. In the text of chapters 10 to 12 of Holism and Evolution, they will undoubtedly find evidence to endorse their criticism. Now, my personal point of view is that one should not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Exactly.
Although much of their criticism may be valid, it does not detract from the overall value of holism as a concept. So in this presentation, I focused on one aspect of the value of holism, which is its optimistic message at a time when the world needed hope. In the time of anxiety after the First World War, when many prophets of doom forecast a downward spiral for humanity, Smuts attempted to positively influence the spirit and thinking of his time with his book. So, in conclusion, I want to summarize by identifying a number of key ways in which holism and evolution, and especially the last three chapters, gives expression to Smuts's optimism. Number one, progressive evolution. Smuts views evolution not as random chance, but as a progressive series of wholes, advancing from simple inorganic matter to complex organisms, mind, and personality. In the holistic process, he sees a steady climb from imperfect to perfect. Two, creative holism. Smuts describes holism as an active, inner driving force of the universe rather than a passive process. This implies that the universe has an innate capacity to produce the emergent new and to self-correct when disturbances such as the Great War occur. Three, perfection of personality. Smuts holds that the ultimate aim of evolution is the development of the free personality. He considers personality the highest form of holism and a creative factor in the universe, giving humans a proactive role in shaping reality. 4. An idealistic Weltanschauung. Smuts believes that the evolutionary process is moving toward the realization of holistic ideals such as truth, beauty, goodness, freedom, love. He argues that in a holistic universe, organized, tolerant coexistence is the rule and destructive warfare the exception, shifting the emphasis to creative cooperation. 5. Optimistic view of human agency. In his focus on the freedom and individuality of the holistic human personality, Smuts suggests that holism confers plasticity, freedom, and creativeness upon humans, allowing them to shape their own development and destiny. Smuts's holism offers a philosophical basis for cooperation and harmony. He believed that as evolution progressed, the holistic tendency would eventually lead to better social and international relations. He applied it to the reality of his time by portraying the League of Nations as an agent for these improved relations. 6. A purposeful soul-making universe. Contrary to the bleak mechanical view of the Victorian era, Smuts' theory suggests the world is a creative laboratory where new, better forms of existence are always possible. In his book, Smuts links his theory of holism to a soul-making process, suggesting that the universe is designed to produce higher spiritual beings. Holism and evolution can be regarded as a deeply optimistic work because it presents a universe that is not merely mechanical or chaotic, but inherently creative, goal-oriented, and progressive. Smuts argues that the universe is evolving towards higher, more complex, and more perfect wholes, culminating in the achievement of the highest spiritual values by the human personality. He suggests that despite setbacks, the universe is a creative, self-organizing system inherently designed to create, improve, and harmonize. In the friendly universe, there is an upward direction toward complexity and order. In 1926, when he wrote his text, Smuts had his fears that the Treaty of Versailles would result in another devastating war. And he had his hopes that the League of Nations could guide international relations away from conflict. He was well aware of the role that the leadership and statesmanship of strong personalities ought to play in steering the holistic process in a forward-moving, progressive direction. In my Afrikaner mind, I link Smuts' message of hope in 1926 with the advice of President Jan Brandt of the Orange Free State in the 1880s. When Smuts was a young student in Stellenbosch, Brandt coined his well-known slogan, Alles zal recht komen als elkeen zijn plicht doet. All will be well if everyone does his duty. Brandt used this phrase to inspire duty and optimism during challenging times. It entered the Afrikaans language as an often used saying to encourage collective responsibility, hard work, and persistence to achieve success. Um, I, in my view, it articulated exactly how Smuts perceived the responsibility of leaders, including himself. The concept of holism transformed the farm boy from Riebeek West into the prophet of hope for the world. His conception of a friendly universe on an upward path, his view that the good is slowly but surely being realized in the world, and his hopeful expectation of the role that the League of Nations could play in promoting a stable, holistic human society. Although not much of these hopes were realized in the rest of the 20th century, can be interpreted as part of the legacy of Smuts's holistic thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That was a rich canvas full of deep ideas. And so we now move into a space where we can actually explore that a little bit. So thank you for that so much. As we move into this discussion period and the question and answer period, I wonder if we can just consider this in respect of the idea of holism as a soul-making process, and the whole idea that the future of the world really rests on the evolution of human personality, the whole making in human personality, and the key concepts of freedom and moral responsibility. And so it gets me to think, in this world, what is the attitude I need to adopt in order to, and what do I need to relinquish in order to revitalize my passion for life in this era that seems to be so crazy? That's the question that I'm going to invite us just to hold as we consider what actually was meaningful for you in that presentation. Now, I see that in the chat box, we've had a comment here from Don White. And Don White asks this question, Kobus. He says, doesn't holism mean oneness with a sentient universe from which humanity was mysteriously but lovingly created? I'll read that again. Doesn't holism mean oneness with a sentient universe from which humanity was mysteriously but lovingly created? What's your thinking about that query?
Sure. Yeah, of course, that links up with Smuts's mysticism. You know, he had these mystic ideas. He read, for example, books by Quaker authors that deals with that. So, but it's for me not so easy to answer that question, because that was probably the topic that he would want to discuss in his follow-up, which never materialized because he never found time to write it. So I don't have a very fixed answer for you. Maybe some of the others, there's so many participants. Maybe someone else will have good ideas about that question, the link between personality and the universe.
I think that what you described there about that the belief in something divine cannot be rationally defined. It's actually a leap of faith, quality of experience. But maybe then the person that can respond to this is Mark Pearson, when he looks at this question of blending or interacting, subtle but a key shift in language. He says your idea of the synthesis of the whole listening personality, blending, interacting, those two factors. Mark, would you like to just reframe your question?
Well, that was probably a completely unnecessary reaction to my use of the word blending, which it's just a word. I'm with Wittgenstein, but in my reaction to the word, comes from the concept of a blender or averages or putting things together, and I see the world as a ongoing interaction of everything. So I just wanted to, because once you think of it as interacting, you can at least have more nuanced conversation. So that was a very trivial point. But I think the question that you just brought up about personality and holism or the cosmos is the most interesting one of the whole talk. And it kept coming back to me and me. And I just put a piece in the chat because, and I'll just stop after this, but my experience of being a human and talking and dealing with other humans is that we, for better or for worse, are always speaking from a point of view. And the wisest people can move between points of view and sort of see a lot of points of view at once. But holism, I go to physics and cosmology and the whole thing out of which we emerged. I view that as much bigger and fundamentally the human biology and therefore psychology is a small, teeny little piece of cosmology. And so I just view, as I say, the best I've seen is Quaker meetings, and we've adapted that in our work to campfire conversations and cave drawings. But it's basically people can try to, for particular purposes and particular groups, try to get toward a holistic perspective only by listening to each other and listening to silence and blending for some particular point of view and purpose in history. So I love Smuts, and I mean, just like anybody at that time, can think in the metaphors and the knowledge we had at the time. So I don't have any problem with anything he says. I just think that Friston's free energy principle gets you a hell of a lot closer to dealing with these problems today, and those didn't exist back in his time. So enough said. Probably too much.
No, that's good. But you did make a point in the chat box. You said when analysis moves ahead of synthesis,
Yes, correct.
expect great harm.
And that's what science was, right? Science and the scientific method it just became so effective at analyzing things, taking pieces apart without contextualizing them in anything that looked like the whole, or it was the European version of the whole, God's on our side and everyone should be modern and we should have progress and all that stuff. So yeah. Anyway, I'm talking too much.
Okay. So I'm going to put this question and just stick up your hands. If Smuts were alive today, what do you think would be his insight and his core offering to humanity today? And anybody stick up your hand. And maybe Quibus, you can sort of even give your thoughts about that.
Can I just say one thing before I quit? I think he'd say optimism is a really good idea.
Mm.
Quibus?
Yeah. Well, there's always been this sort of swing in the mood of the what I call the zeitgeist between optimism and pessimism. In a sense, we are now in a similar situation, with everything that's happening around us in the world. So uh, I think we can, you know, take a leaf out of Smuts's book, and I think in a large way, religion, the idea of well, human perfection or human moral perfection, although it's in religion, it's in the afterlife, not so much on this earth. But I think also in religion, there has been a big change. I don't know about who of these participants are religious people, but I know that in churches, for example, there's much more focus on uh, on religion as something that has to reach out to your neighbors to improve society today. I think there's not so much in sermons and so on about the afterlife anymore. I think most of the ministers of religion focus very much on how can my religious beliefs be of service in society today. So So in a way, I think Smuts also reasoned in that way, that and his ideas about his optimistic ideas stemmed from his religious beliefs. But maybe we should start chatting amongst one another. Maybe there are others who would like to make inputs on these ideas.
Well, you said that it was in the evolution of personality and the wholeness of personality that the future resided. But Gabriel is saying, how did we define that? Gabriel, will you put your question to Professor Du Pisani and to the group? Where is she? Are you here, Gabriel?
Yeah, she's here.
Yeah, I had to unmute myself first. So thank you. Yes, I realized that some of the things, the words you mentioned, Mr. Pisani, that the words in different discussions maybe mean something different. So I would find it from your perspective very interesting to define how Smuts was relating on personality. And is this personality we are talking in nowadays about in psychology, or is it in sociology? So that would be very helpful for me.
Hmm. I'm not really sure that I can answer. I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist. I'm a historian. So, and also I'm not a philosopher. So some of these questions are a bit uh, out of my away from my experience. But maybe you can just reformulate your question so that I can think about it.
Yeah, maybe in the way that if you use the term, there comes context from a certain field, what the term is about. And if I hear the word personality, I always think like, okay, character maybe, but personality, I want to get rid of that. I want to get of the essence behind the personality. So what was Smuts talking about using the term? There was different days. Maybe the term even has changed now, is in different use. So to find our way with this, because I react on it. I'm feeling like,
Mm,
no, I want to get behind my personality. It is too much
mm,
in the front, like an
Yeah.
image of
mm,
myself.
Yeah, let me give a thought on that one, and then you come back on that, Kobus. So the question that you say, what's behind this manifest way that I respond to the world, is exactly what Smuts was focused on. The key word was inwardness, developing inner depth, the capacity to deep self-reflection. But part of that was in relation to my context. So, to the extent that I was deeply relating to my context and internalizing my context into my identity, I was building personality. Another word would be
Mhm,
soul, another word would be character, but he used
mhm,
personality
mhm,
with a capital P. So, as the external world and myself integrated, and my being expanded by that integration with existence, personality was the soul. That's what it was all about in my understanding of it.
mm.
What's
Okay.
behind your question is absolutely pertinent, Gabriel.
Yeah. What Smuts did say was that what's important for the development of personality, which he found from his study in Whitman, for example, was that the way in which strong personalities or great personalities can sort of reach higher levels of spirituality is through willpower and moral discipline. That was what he um, emphasized, not emotions, not feelings. It's a more rational, you know, control. You through your willpower, through moral discipline, you can you can control you can say the development of your own personality to higher levels of freedom, because the ideal, as I said, was freedom. And freedom is also a bit of a fuzzy concept in some of the writings in these chapters by Smuts. He said in the book, it's introductory and preliminary study of holism. It's not the final word. So I think he threw in many of these ideas to stimulate further, thinking, further discussion about how you can exactly define this process, because it's all part of the whole making process of the personality as well. Yeah, that's about as far as I can get.
Thank you for that, Kobus. Now, I'm going to ask you this question on behalf of William Fraser. Now, in fact, I'll ask, William, are you there? And then I see a hand is up there. Are you?
No, I am here.
You're there, William.
I
You
mean,
were
I'm
asking
just
something about Smuts and nature. Ask your question.
no. To what extent was his thinking also formed by observing nature? By observing nature, I mean, we know of Smuts's relationship with Eugene Marais and people like that, and his very, very deep understanding and fascination with observing nature. To what extent are a lot of what he is talking about? I mean, if you think that during the Boer War, he's out in the veld, he's solidly in the veld. As a kid, he's solidly in the veld. I mean, does he only get enlightenment because he goes to Cambridge and studies philosophers? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, must I answer, Claudius?
Yeah.
Of course, he lived very close to nature, Smuts. The first 12 years of his life before he went to school, he was there on the farm, and he I think his whole teleological approach started from there. What I read, and as I say, I don't know too much about psychology, but what I read was that psychologists say that teleology is a thing that starts, or that way of thinking starts in childhood, because children are, when they uh, uh, observe nature, they have questions about the purpose of things. What's the purpose of the spider web, or what? And so I think that closeness to nature, for Smuts throughout his life, had a very strong spiritual association. If you think, for example, about the speech that he made about the religion of the mountain when he was up there at Maclear's Beacon on Table Mountain, you get that idea that that's part of what we said about the idea of your inwardness, that you refer to Claudius, the inner light that the Quakers speak about, is that it's quite true, I would say, that nature and his observations in nature was also a route. Maybe it's good that you mention it, because that's then something that I omitted from my roots of his optimism. Excuse me, I have to cough first, so you'll have to ask someone else.
Nameka's got his hand up.
Okay. So, Nameka, you have a question whilst Kobus clears his throat. And then, Marcus, there's a question you have. So, Nameka.
Hey, Claudius, Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts, and it's been an interesting session listening to Kobus read about Smuts' thoughts, and personologies, did resonate with me, and I tend to think of it that if Smoot was to be in today's world, what could be his thought on the recent happenings? And the sincere truth is, I don't know. Because no one knows. We are all evolutionary. It could be that he could think differently more than we assume he would. But if we could draw inference from his thoughts, then we can start to think that he may be more on the optimistic side of things, or perhaps more realistic. And then to wrap it up on that, I think personology speaks to me about the possibility of one becoming awakened to look not only outside with an eyes of curiosity, but to look inwards with a longing for knowing. Because it says that he who looks inward awakens. And a beautiful thought by an interesting soul says, I will walk on myself, since the work on myself is the greatest thing I can ever do for it all. Since I understand that as man up-levels his own consciousness, he starts to see creative solutions to the problems that he is confronting. I will work on myself. And that was from Ramdas. So to summarize in all, I think the greatest realms of thinking comes when we realize our power to choose. And that choice is at the very heart of the evolutionary nature of the human person. Thank you.
Love that. Love that. So thank you, Rebecca. Yes. Maybe we can get you to do a presentation in the future of this festival.
Yeah, hopefully. Fingers crossed.
So, Marcus, you asking that same kind of question. What was his experience? Can you pose it? Can you pose that again?
Well, thank you, Claudius, and thank you, Professor Du Pisani, for this really insightful talk. Well, I formulated it in two different ways. The first one is that I'm interested in the Smuts as a young boy in nature, in the Veld. Let's call him the Veld boy. And I'm interested in Smuts, the statesman, who is meeting with world leaders and at times of crisis. And as you've shown, his life frequently goes through upheaval. And then in this process, he somehow grounds himself with his work, Holism and Evolution, as though in a way he's reminding himself of something that is deep in him, that is embattled by the political life. I'm aware that there was this moment before his formal education that he had an experience or in the Veld where he felt he had a oneness with things, which for me is a very interesting starting point for, in modern terms, let's call it a way of knowing the world or an epistemology. And then as a statement, as in later life, he writes Holism and Evolution, but I think part of the problem is the eye of the needle of the audience that will hear him. So he chooses a particular vocabulary and a particular jargon and a particular pitch in order to bring ideas to the fore that I think might have got a bit lost in the process of the translation. So in very crude ways, is it somehow possible to articulate in outline what is that world knowing of the young boy, and what is that, how does that knowing transform because of formal education, Cambridge, and the statesmanship?
I think the young boy part, maybe Claudius, you can answer, because you did a paper on Smuts as a young boy.
Yeah. Well, let me give a few short responses to that. Firstly, as you already told us, he was out in the veld before formal schooling until the age of 12. And so it was his experience in the veld and sitting with a Khoisan herdsman who was intimately aware and related to the natural environment, where they had a long conversation sitting around a fire, fascinated about the Khoisan's natural relationship with the natural working order. That's cardinal. The second one was that he didn't have formal education. He wasn't programmed to the epistemology that Marcus talks about of the day. His early programming, his formation was actually right there in the veld, right there, as you said, Pilgrim of the World, Son of the Veld, in your book. And then there was this mystical experience that he had on the mountain, where he felt that his ego boundaries dissolved and he became one with the world, and yet he had a distinct sense of self. And I describe that in the chapter in the book that will be published very shortly. And so I think Marcus is right that he had to do the same blending or interaction that Mark Pearson spoke about between his inherent experience of the self, his knowledge of another deeper quality of self, and then the formal education at school, the formal education at Victoria College in science, in literature, and then his legal education at Cambridge University and his introduction to world philosophy. And so he had to do the very blending or synthesis that actually was soul-making, soul-building, that eventually describes in Holism and Evolution. So I think without that experience that you're asking about, Marcus, Holism and Evolution wouldn't have happened. He said, I saw a light as a young boy, and I followed that light ever since. And that was a synthesis of his spiritual insight and of his real visceral experience of living in nature. Yeah. I want to go, before we kind of running to the end, we don't have to rush this. I want to go to Christopher Cook. And Christopher, you've got a question there about the festival. Are you there still, Christopher? So maybe I'll read. You there?
Claudius, can you help? Can you hear me?
Yes. Go.
Can I just add to something that you were talking about earlier?
Yes, absolutely.
Marcus was talking about the nature aspect. I'll deal with that in my talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
But to give a sense of what Smuts was trying to say about how his form of knowing, holism had to be experienced.
Yeah.
And it was very similar to Goethe's conscious participation in nature. And there's a strong parallel between the two. Smuts's way of knowing, of interacting with nature, was a conscious participation, difficult to put into words. And he articulates this throughout his life. He talks about that experience becomes more important than intellectual understanding. Just a word on synthesis, just by the way. He also had a problem with synthesis, although he used it, was part of his vocabulary all the time. But he did note from time to time that synthesis sort of meant putting together again something that had broken apart. So he had a problem with synthesis as a concept, because there shouldn't even be a need to synthesize back again. Once you're synthesizing, you already have this dualism where you're putting together something that's been separated. And it's very interesting how he mentions that over the years. I just wanted to throw that in. And by the way, Marcus I appreciate his pronunciation of holism, which is exactly how Smuts pronounced it.
Holism.
I'll talk tomorrow some more, and I'll deal with nature quite a bit in my talk tomorrow. Thanks, Claudius.
Thank you. So let me give you an advertisement right here that Jeff is busy writing a book, nearly there, on the sequel. What would he have written from deep, deep research over so many years? And the hidden stuff that was not in Holism and Evolution. As Mark has said, it actually used a particular kind of language to address the kind of audience he wanted to. But the deeper dimension of that was unwritten, but was in letters. And so Jeff is going to be taking us through a much deeper insight into the spirituality of holism tomorrow. We look forward to it so much.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, excellent.
Claudius, it's Christopher. I do apologise. I was on walkabout in the kitchen. I could hear you all, and I've got you all projected onto the wall here. So I just didn't have the technology to be able to interact at that time.
So do you want to put your question, Christopher?
It was more an observation. I realised that for me that I started to realise perhaps that for myself this festival, this conversation over the next few weeks and months is actually the means by which some of the questions that I'm seeing posed here by others and by myself, it will become clearer, because at the start of this event, this festival, I realised that we're creating a space in which we'll discover ways of articulating and comprehending that which at the start we couldn't. And I just wanted to recognise that in my comment in the chat, because I think if anything that, and I really appreciated the presentation today. Where's it gone?
Professor Du Pisani.
Kobus, thank you so much for your presentation today. It was a wonderful synopsis, and for me, it was a means of relaxing into and confirming or reaffirming the knowing, but also discovering new spaces. And a phrase that I put into the chat is really, it's a North American Plains Indian term, which is the sayat that I experience, is to the best of my present knowledge. And what I was experiencing through your presentation and through the questions was I was being invited to upstretch into places I couldn't answer myself or articulate my responses to your questions and your observations, because I literally don't have the language at the moment to go there. And so I'm complete.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm going to give a last opportunity to Aura around the question of optimism. Aura, would you address that?
Hi. I'm not sure how to address it other than to say that knowing a little bit about that period of time and the idea of a religious I'm going to call it clairvoyance just because I for lack of another word, but that sense of belonging to a world that isn't tangible, that isn't part of our normal everyday language. There was a large number of bodies of interest, and it occurred to me as I was listening that in our modern day, we've got all these terms that we're using so specifically to kind of regularize what we're speaking of, whereas it would be so much. My thought was the idea of optimism. If you're an organic being, the nature of being alive is optimistic. It's not something that you have to mentally arrive at. You are born it. A child, if you just watch them crawling, that curiosity, that fun, that rolling over, all of that. And so I was just thinking, as we're exploring this deeper together, it would be wonderful to let our language dissolve a little bit into the liquid of unification and being alive, and just allowing because it really, I felt when I was listening to Du Pisani, when I was listening, I just felt this sort of childlike flavor in Smuts. Beyond all the sort of things that he's acquired in his life and done, there was this natural kind of childlikeness and innocence and sort of willingness to be in that resonant field.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely, lovely.
Yeah. A last word from you, Kobus?
Yeah, he was, of course, living in especially when I studied his period in London from 1917 to 1919. He was living in two different worlds because he was there at the Imperial War Conference with all those statesmen discussing the future of the British Empire. And then over the weekends, he fled to his friends in Oxford and Street, the Gillett and Clark families. And if you look at the correspondence between him and some of those, his relationship with those women and men, each one was unique. And but it was as if, out in nature, he became very childlike. Um, uh, away. You get the idea. He just wanted to get away from the bright lights of London and spend time with these Quaker friends of his, doing normal things, picnics and walks in the countryside and so on. So, yeah, I think you are quite right to say that the the fact of life is already optimistic, but I don't think everybody experiences it quite like that. Smuts basically wrote the Holism and Evolution as to instill hope in this anxious times. Maybe to give himself hope as well, because he was not very happy with the Treaty of Versailles, and he was quite he knew that trouble was just around the corner again. But yes, this childlikeness of him when he was in the veld, looking at the grasses and so on, that is certainly part of his optimism. This idea that you spoke about of oneness, this magical moment that experienced as a child and that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Um, but yes, I think it's a important part of the legacy of his book, that he brought this message of hope, which he focused on in the deepest times of trouble. He always had a message of hope for the Boer people after the Second Anglo-Boer War, for the European people after the First World War, and when he made that speech in 42 before both houses of Parliament in London, also saying that, well, we haven't won the war yet, but we must look forward. We must hope for a better world.
Thank you, Kobus. Thank you. My mind goes to the biblical statement, without a vision, the nation perishes. And with that, I hand back to Michael.
Yes, just thank you, Claudius. It's an extraordinary role to open and to close, and to have the luxury of listening very carefully. So I'll only say a few words by way of ending. Firstly, just thank you all for your for your company, your thoughts and questions on this first day. And thank you very greatly to Professor Kobus Du Pisani, who, speaking in a sort of personal way, you have opened many doors to wanting to understand more about a man who I now know just a little more about his time. And thank you particularly, of course, to Claudius, Michel, and the team who brought this great festival to us. So thank you very much. Tomorrow is another day, and we've had a brief taster, and we will meet together at the same time on the same Zoom link. And here, as we have just Jeff Bloomberg, as he mentioned, towards a spiritual world view inspired by Jan Smuts. And if I may say, it's a very, very sort of different world 100 years ago from our age of machines. I'm looking forward. Thank you so much.
Great.
We look forward to being with you tomorrow for day 2. And I'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Dankie Kobus. Dankie.
Dankie.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Super well done. Thank you. Thank you, Kobus. Thank you, Claudius. Thank you, everybody who made this happen.